usually gets me into Zoom meetings, but not apparently as a host or co-host. Anyway, the talk title, there we go, is The Flexible Floras of the San Francisco Peninsula's Coastal Lagoons. And it's titled that in reference to the resilience and persistence of some of the primary native species that historically compose the vegetation of the San Francisco Peninsula's coastal lagoons. They've adapted and reassembled themselves to radically changed and very highly degraded conditions. Some of them have, but there are also some limits to that floristic flexibility, and that's marked by the enormous losses of native species that have become extirpated by changes that exceeded their tolerances. They have limits. So I'll be, as usual, going to frame some of the botany of the coast in terms of the physical geography of the setting and the processes that govern the ecosystems on which these plants depend, and also very much focused on the historical ecology, including land use changes from early historic to modern, which have propagated ecological influences over time, not just in response to recent conditions. And that all, of course, is a segue to future options and opportunities for the lagoon flora here that are forced on us in a good way, maybe, we'll see, by sea level rise and climate change. Usually that's sort of a gloom and doom topic, but as some land uses become less feasible, sometimes better opportunities come up. So I'll explore those too, try to end on a positive note. So on the title slide, the featured lagoon I'll probably have most slides on is Laguna Salada in Pacifica, owned and managed by the City of San Francisco Park and Rec Department. And two examples of some of the flexible examples, California Tules, Conoplectus californicus, still here with us, and some of the losses, Coral pennywort, long gone from Lake Merced, formerly there. So I'll be spanning the range of examples of that flexible flora. Could I have the next slide? Oh, I see it scrolls. Sorry about that. So I'll begin with the setting and locations of the historic and modern San Francisco Peninsula coastal lagoons. The locations going from north to south, the end members, are the historical Presidio swamp, also known in Kate Brandigee's catalog of plants of San Francisco, 1892, as Presidio marshes or Presidio marsh. It's the location of the current Crissy Field, including the much smaller Crissy Field lagoon and marsh system that's been restored within the footprint of that much larger Presidio swamp. Then there is Laguna de la Merced, which is the old name that appeared in the earliest maps of the area, later retitled by the 20th century as Lake Merced. That is a coastal lagoon and not an inland lake that happens to be by the coast. The comedy relief for the evening will be Laguna Salada, which in many ways is kind of like a parody of coastal planning, but also very much it's a very important coastal wetland. I'll spend a fair amount of time on it, but its history is just amazing. It's a little less rational than many of the other examples. The least known lake or lagoon is Lake Matilda, which is now Lindemar. It is it is effectively completely extirpated. There are small wetlands left within its footprint, but that is basically San Pedro Valley, the Lindemar residential and shopping center area, represented today only by the mouth of the artificially channelized San Pedro Creek. Spent a little bit of time on that. And finally, included as the other southern end member is Pillar Point Lagoon, which really is, Half Moon Bay, but it is related in this suite of coastal lagoons. And I'm including it because it's also the end member of one of the best preserved lagoons left. Despite its small size, it's very much in its own historic footprint, like the other reference lagoon I'll be discussing, which is Rodeo Lagoon, sort of a sister lagoon on the other side of the Golden Gate. So next slide, please. So one of the characteristic features of coastal lagoons, they're variously defined, but the geomorphic definitions all relate to their being enclosed by a barrier beach. And a barrier beach means that there's a coarse-grained, wave-built, not a sandbar, but an emergent barrier above tides that chokes off or closes off, impounds water behind it, either as a moist valley, a marsh, an open water lagoon, or in some cases, a tidal estuary. Those tidal estuaries can be intermittent, off and on, closed and open, or they can be, as many of our lagoons are, mostly closed and only in contact with ocean water under extreme conditions, usually very large storms. The other physical framework I really need to impress is that we tend to think of almost all coastal wetlands right behind the beach as salt marshes and as saline wetlands. It's reflected even in the names, popular names, folk names like Laguna Salada, Salt Lake. But what it means is these are salt influenced, but they're not necessarily like San Francisco Bay salt ponds, which are, hypersaline, hyperhaline, or full salinity tidal marshes that exclude freshwater marsh species. They have varying degrees of salt influence that varies in space and in time, and not always in a predictable linear manner. This is an example of Rodeo Lagoon, which is one of the less altered coastal lagoons in the vicinity of the Golden Gate. And it's, by less altered, I mean it has not been converted to extensive farmland. It had a ranching history. It has no major infrastructure. There is a berm constructed at the back by some of the earlier ranch land owners who impounded water for stock watering. So there is very, very typical of lagoons. Portions of them are impounded to augment freshwater supplies. But before that berm was there was a gradient that led all the way to freshwater riparian scrub and freshwater marsh. So this is typical of the gradients you have when coastal lagoons are either intermittently open to the ocean infrequently or predominantly closed. They tend to be somewhat salt influenced by overwash and some salt seepage during low lagoon stands close to the back of the barrier. There's sort of a mesohaline, popular term brackish marsh, which is about somewhere around half the strength of seawater. That's where we get brackish marsh species like alkali bulrush, often dominant. And then the other technical term is oligohaline, which means slightly salty. Freshback brackish is an easier descriptor for that. And that includes most of the typical freshwater marsh species that can grow fairly well down to about 5 parts per thousand. 5 parts per thousand would taste off. You wouldn't want to drink it. It's, not great potable water. Cattle can use it, but most freshwater marsh plants can actually grow or at least survive in oligohaline salinity range. That's typical, say, of Sassoon marsh, and occasionally you get higher pulses of salinity. But that's kind of the an idealized layout of coastal lagoons in our region. And the important thing to remember here is that these are not static, predictable, stable systems. They fluctuate, and that's part of the mechanism that maintains the diversity of plant species in them. Next slide. So I'm going to start with physical processes because that's the way plants are going to experience these lagoons. So if you can understand how water and sediment moves through the system, interacts with plants, it really opens up insights to how these lagoons functioned historically and how they have been impaired. So this is a long axis view of Rodeo Lagoon from the northern headland. This is during a high lagoon stand after a number of freshets, high rainfall events that poured a lot of fresh water into Rodeo Valley. You can see, if you have good depth perception and a little bit of imagination, you can sort of see that the lagoon water surface is well above the swash zone, the wave backwash zone. It's probably 4 or 5 feet higher. So there's a lot of head between this overfilling lagoon almost to the crest of the beach and where the tides are. Of course, the tides rise and fall. It's probably mid-tide about this stage. And you can see there's a sheen of water that looks kind of like a wave just ran up the beach and washed back and it left it saturated. But that is not wave wash. That is seepage and actually active springs of fresh water that are being pushed through the permeable beach by the hydraulic head, the high pressure of water backed up on the landward side of the lagoon. So you can think of these barrier beaches as permeable dams, sand filters that are slow enough to seep to hold water back so it can actually rise and fill up faster than it can seep. But when lagoons fill up, they pour through their beaches, and it's actually a way they can, sort of equilibrate and manage their levels without actually blowing out and breaching. So I'll show you an example of that. Keep in mind, this happens most of the year. The elevation range of wetlands on the landward side of these barriers is not averaged to the tides. It's not mean high tide, like a salt marsh. It's perched above, often several feet above mean high water. So very different from salt marshes. So when these blow open and release their water, their marshes are kind of stranded. They're hanging. Next slide. Show you the next stage of how lagoons communicate with the ocean, various ways. Here you can see active seepage causing little gullying in the beach face. Again, this is falling tide, so you can see there's no recent foam lines or swash. That is the lagoon moving right through the barrier beach. And this is not unique to Rodeo Lagoon. This is how most of them operate. They discharge seaward rather than towards land. Next slide. Can we scroll? There we go. And now, once that capacity to seep is exceeded by the rate of filling of a lagoon from freshwater discharges, which can be both groundwater and surface waters, but in this case, it's rapid runoff after a series of storms. Here you can see the lagoon starting to spill very low energy, not very erosive, over the top of the beach. But this is the beginning of the process of a more rapid, dynamic, and very dramatic change in the lagoon connection to the ocean. Next slide. And little run up. I've shifted beaches, little sleight of hand here. I have much better photos of the breach process going to completion from Walala Point Beach on the southern limit of the Mendocino coast. So I'm going to use this as a stand-in for Laguna Salada and for Rodeo Lagoon as the example. Next slide. Starting to spill over. The beach is completely saturated. Here it's overtopped because of the head difference between the overfilled lagoon and where the tide stage is. There is a steep gradient, gravity-fed flow, lot of head. This is a very erosional gullying that will expand very rapidly. It's actually quite dangerous if you're on the beach watching it. It's not advisable to get that close and stay there. Yeah, this is the last slide you'll see looking down the mouth of that gully. It head cuts rapidly right through the beach and will make a chasm through that barrier beach in a matter of minutes. Next slide. And now we're getting a little further. That is the beginning of, there are standing waves. That's not an ocean wave coming in. That's a standing wave. That's just the harmonic motion of very rapid freshwater flow pushing out. Some of those standing waves are about 6 to 8 feet high. This would knock anybody but a seal over. Next slide. I just would mention that breaching process from landward to seaward can drain a lagoon in about 2 hours, depending on the size of the lagoon, but it's a very rapid process. So once in a blue moon, very infrequently, these mostly closed tidal lagoons will have a rapid drop in level. They usually close up very rapidly too, and refill, it's not a daily or monthly or weekly occurrence. It is a semi-annual occurrence, maybe I would say closer to a decadal scale. So though there are very dramatic changes in lagoon hydrology, those extreme events are naturally rare. This is a much less rare form of ocean salinity intrusion into lagoons. This is storm wave overwash. It's very different from that highly turbulent, energetic mixing you get with breaches. Now, once that breach in the previous slide opens up to tide level, there is, tidal exchange that's temporary that causes a lot of brackish mixing in the lagoon behind it until waves close off that inlet. But this is a different kind of communication with lagoons. Waves overtopping and overwashing the lagoon are kind of like a sheet flow, depending on how large the wave bores are. Sometimes it's like swash sheeting over, like in this photo. Sometimes it's more of a wave bore like the one you see in the background. These drop into a lagoon, but because that seawater is heavier than the fresh water that's impounded behind it, it sinks underneath it. So the stratification or layering of these lagoon waters is different between breaches and overwashes. Just because there is salt water entering the lagoon, again, this is the difference between a plant's perspective and an aquatic invertebrate or a fish's perspective. The fish and invertebrates at the bottom of the lagoon are definitely going to be experiencing a change in the salinity of that environment, but not necessarily so for the plants. They are rooted in higher elevation zones that are bathed in floating fresh to fresh brackish water. Next slide. Anyway, that'll come up in some of the other examples I'll show you. And here's the upshot for that. Again, to sort of change perspectives on salinity gradients of wetlands right behind the beach. This is not an unusual occurrence. It's not an anomaly for San Francisco Peninsula lagoons. It's typical of Northern California all the way to through the Pacific Northwest. High beach crests with watersheds that are, not in perpetual drought, tend to impound fresh water above high tide and above wave run-up levels. So they concentrate, back up that fresh water, saturate the permeable sediments. And so you get these freshwater plant communities or fresh brackish communities right behind the beach. And these are two common examples with some of the species you'll see. One is the Pilorcitos Creek mouth, where the actual bed of the creek is above tide because a lot of sand moves through that watershed. So it's not just a basin that could fill with overwash. The bed and the sheet flow of the summer sheet flow of the creek is above tide. And so we see beds of watercress, Nasturtium officinale, Oenanthe sarmentosa, water celery, water parsley, not so good with common names, and coast bulrush. All very salt intolerant species growing luxuriantly, not looking very salt stressed, right behind the beach. And at the mouth of San Pedro Creek in Pacifica, completely open to winter overwash. It goes right to the Highway 1 bridge when the plants are dormant in winter and not particularly sensitive to salt. During the growing season, they are bathed in fresh water, and you get dominant species include again, coast bulrush, California bulrush, so-called salt rush, which tends to be a brackish species, and willows, which are highly salt sensitive. In fact, there's even some Scirpus microcarpus, which is a very salt sensitive sedge species, right up to the back of the beach. Next slide. There we go. And some of that variability also defies classification. If you look at vegetation maps and characterizations of vegetation types for particular locations, things are usually pigeonholed into salt marsh, brackish marsh, freshwater marsh. But what's really significant about lagoons is it's not a question of where the boundary is between two discrete types or even continuous linear zones of intergrading vegetation types, freshwater marsh, saltwater marsh. These are fluctuating mosaics which shift very abruptly over the life history of individual plant clones. So here you have this anomaly. Again, it's only an anomaly of expectation, not an anomaly of reality. This is another model lagoon, relatively unaltered, some agricultural history, of Laguna Creek Lagoon in Santa Cruz. This is mostly closed. It's open seasonally during high flows. The lagoon wetlands behind them, you can see, must have spent years or decades as a salt marsh, because you can see that the ground layer is dominated by Pacific pickleweed, one of the most salt tolerant plants in our coastal flora, Sarcocornia pacifica. But there are also very robust young colonies, more than a few years old. The tules in the background, Scinaplectus californicus, are tall, and that's probably at least 4 or 5 years continuous expansion, and they are invading this salt marsh. So do you classify it as a salt marsh with, subdominance of freshwater marsh? What it is, it's behaving as an ecosystem rather than a vegetation type. And this is, again, a characteristic feature of San Francisco Peninsula coastal lagoons, and also ones of other locations on the Central Coast. So it's not unusual to see this juxtaposition and intermixing of salt-sensitive and salt-tolerant plants in our native plants. Next slide. So, going local, starting at the north end of our lagoon suite, this is the Presidio Marsh as it would have been mapped in Kate Brandigee's day. Again, Kate Brandigee, one of the early California, San Francisco area botanists who published the first catalog of plants. Well, actually, it's after Bayer, it's the second flora, but specifically for San Francisco. And she did that partly in response to the vanishing flora. She was aware of that, made it explicit in her foreword. So she was visiting these sites to do inventory of what species were where. And this is, of course, 50 years or so after the gold rush, so a lot of changes have occurred. She found, again, if you look at the configuration of this large recurved sand spit and the marsh behind it, it looks, if you saw that configuration today, you'd say, well, that's a salt marsh and a dune. But the species, if you go through all the species she listed, there were no records of Spartina foliosa, California cordgrass from the Presidio Marsh. There is a record of Sarcocornia pacifica, but she listed it as Presidio, but not Presidio Marsh. And she listed everything else as Presidio Marsh. But she did list all these salt-sensitive species I've just shown you at these other model lagoons. Azolla folliculoides, which is a fresh, brackish, floating aquatic fern, Scinaplectus californicus, tules, Elaeocoris macrostachya, creeping spike rush. These are all brackish marsh species that she was finding in the late 19th century. And I would point out that Hans Bayer, I gave a previous talk on his early observations of San Francisco. He pointed out that there was a fringe of umbellularia, California Bay, along the shoreline near Fort Point, and that mirrors Menzies' description of the shoreline there, as well as his record of going on shore to collect fresh drinking water in a pond behind the shoreline. You can see that pond mapped right in the upper corner of the 1851 map. That is gone by 1869 mapping. It's filled in and there's a road across it. But that is a freshwater pond. So my interpretation is that there existed a fresh, an east to west, west to east, fresh to brackish to haly gradient along the Presidio Marsh. It was not one type. It was just a very elongated version that's typical of the mixed composite gradient of marsh types behind the barrier beach. Next slide. It's just an next slide, just an overlay. So that's how I would interpret Kate Brandigee's records, I won't go through the full list, but to make sense of that in context of these other lagoons and what we understand about the hydrologic processes of the lagoons, that's probably reflective of the complexity of the flora of that lagoon. It's not one type. Next slide. Just to highlight, this is a close-up of the 1851 condition in the U.S. Coast Survey sheet. You can see that that pond at Fort Point has no surface water connections shown. And of course, it has all of that serpentine slope seeping down into it. That serpentine seep is very active today. There's freshwater marsh at the toe of that slope today on the road to Fort Point. And that intermediate zone with no channels shown, probably where the brackish marshes were in 1851. And there is, you can see it's some overlapping sandbars or sand shoals at that apparently open tidal inlet. That suggests some degree of tidal choking. So again, not a typical tidal salt marsh based on the whole comprehensive suite of available geographic and floristic information. Next slide. Thank you. Sorry about the scrolling. This is the backup copy of the PDF I gave in case the Zoom connection didn't work for me. This is a kind of high point for the lagoon suite. This is the Pillar Point Lagoon. It's not an official name. It's when I apply to it. It occurs at the north end of Half Moon Bay in a shelter position. If you go to this location, it's still there. It's evolved a bit, but it is not trashed. It is not strongly manipulated. Actually, it shows that there's a little jetty. It's marked wharf on that map for reproduction. So someone tried to make a little inlet. There's no channel there this is the far west end, but someone tried to make like a little entry canal in there. I guess they gave up. There's no trace of that today. But here you can see the barrier beach with a linear high tide line marking the edge of vegetation. There's a large open water lagoon with some interspersed marsh and a slightly different marsh symbol at the head of the lagoon, which I will interpret as a freshwater marsh. And you can see that there's a slender channel pointing outward at the at the east end, closed outlet channel. That's still there today. Next slide. Here's just fleshed out the interpretations that I would make blind if I didn't know the site, based on the landscape positions and the analogies with other reference lagoons that are relatively less altered, like Rodeo Lagoon, a freshwater riparian scrub zone at the head of the lagoon, seasonal brackish freshwater lagoon gradients in the middle, a seasonal tidal inlet, probably burst open during flood flows, closing in the summer. And you can see some of the widening of what look like remnants of washover fans. No high dunes here. It's facing south-southeast. It's sheltered by Pillar Point, so it's facing away from the dominant wind directions. You don't expect much dune development there. That means more wave processes. This is before Pillar Point Harbor was enclosed by a jetty, so it was getting a little more refracted swell passing around that headland. So next slide. I'll try to not speed this up. I'll try not to linger so long. And here it is today. This is kind of a splendid survivor among our coastal lagoons, which is part of the reason why I included it. It has been altered. There's a road, of course, that's cutting off the north end. What that seems to have done is it's let the freshwater riparian scrub migrate closer to the barrier beach, kind of like that impoundment at the head of Rodeo Lagoon. That's mostly willow scrub with an understory of small-fruited sedge, Scirpus microcarpus, and Carex obnupta, common shade-tolerant freshwater marsh plant. So that's expanded freshwater marsh, but there's a reduced open water area where we used to have a large lagoon, but that's common. It's a normal trajectory for lagoon evolution to fill in with tidal marsh. And it has filled in with a lot of salt marsh at the seaward end and brackish at the landward end. Next slide. And here is a little example of an opportunity that was afforded by coastal erosion, shoreline retreat, loss of infrastructure, and sea level rise. Mostly local, mostly internal erosional patterns within the harbor. But it's kind of I'd say it's an object lesson for how we can deal with some of these externally forced coastal changes and how we can make them into opportunities. So anyway, historically, as you saw on that last map, the west side of the lagoon was rocky shore. It was the Pillar Point headland. There were no beaches there. The beach was at the Barrier Beach. There was a little beach that had been there in modern times. It kind of buffered the coastal trail to Mavericks Beach, very popular destination. It buffered it against erosion, but that shifted about 10 years ago, and rapid wave erosion cut into the very well-used trail. You know, the default responses usually get riprap out there, rebuild things, harden the shoreline, get rid of the habitats. The harbor district, San Mateo Harbor District, made a different decision. They adopted living shoreline preferences. So they extended that Barrier Beach to a fringing beach over a cobble berm. And we extended, I got on the team, and we extended all native flora from the Barrier Beach, minus the ice plant, and reintroduced a couple of species that were historically present at Pillar Point Harbor, but became extirpated. So we now have an extension of that beach. So what was a constraint and a coastal hazard has turned into an ecological opportunity to amplify some of those low-lying beach resources, which have a distinctive flora, which I'll show you in the next slide. So instead of the usual arid, high, rapidly accreting dunes, the beach is in this sheltered, wave-sheltered shoreline with an impounded lagoon. Remember the Rodeo Lagoon example where the lagoon seeps right through the beach when it's full? Well, the groundwater in this beach is very high. And the vegetation is sort of a mix between the more drainage tolerant salt marsh species like salt grass, Disticus spicata, and a naturally occurring hybrid ryegrass. It's a hybrid between beach wild rye or American dune grass, Lamus mollis, and the widespread valley wild rye or alkali wild rye or bearded wild rye, Lamus triticioides, also called Elemus triticioides. But they form a naturally occurring hybrid. It's very widespread, often mistaken for Lamus mollis because it looks very similar until it flowers. But it forms these spreading colonies of creeping native grasses over the beach instead of the usual aridity tolerant, well-drained dune forms. And so we use these as the dominants to spread over that new foredune. Next slide. So it's sort of a local diversity of the flora. And we were also fortunate enough to get the cooperation from the Harbor District to let us reintroduce some special status, well, one special status species and one species that doesn't currently have special status, but probably will in some future date. It's becoming increasingly scarce. Coastal marsh milk vetch. This was historically the northernmost location of the San Mateo coast population, metapopulation. Hasn't been recorded there in many decades. I recently got an inquiry from CNPS. They found it there and wondered how it got there. I filled them in. This is a derivative from the largest population at Pescadero, greatest genetic diversity. Had it propagated on contract. Did beautifully, produced huge amounts of seed the first year. Voles ate out a lot of the plants in the wet areas where they normally thrive, but the beach populations, which are very unattractive to voles, survived, and they are still flowering and fruiting. So go down there and see them if you want. The other species is the beach ecotype of pink sand verbena. This is typically found in low energy beaches, often connected to lagoons where the seeds wash in and bank. It's a perennial. It acts as an annual sometimes, but it's a perennial, unlike the typical dune form, which is annual in Monterey Bay and South. This is now back at Pillar Point. So here's an opportunity to reintroduce lost elements following years of reduction and degradation. Even in the better preserved examples of coastal lagoons, we lose species. So here's an opportunity to bring them back. Next slide, please. And just to confirm the hypothesis with peeking into the hypothesis. Here is the head of the lagoon, the landward end of it, where the freshwater gradient pushes out into that open salt marsh. And you can see there's no berm, there's no hydrologic barrier at all. This is one flat marsh plain integrating cattail, getting shorter and shorter as it gets into the more saline reaches of the marsh, grading right into pickleweed. And as you get towards the road edge, near the culverts, we get the full complement of the typical freshwater marsh species, California bulrush. Actually, this looks like hardstem. I get some, yeah, I'll trust my notes. Hardstem bulrush and California blackberry, grading right with no barrier between them and the salt marsh. So next slide. So again, that diversity of our marshes is kind of built into these fluctuating salinity and freshwater gradients. So here is one of the, this is probably the largest lagoon in our suite. This has a long and complex history. I'd love to go into the full history of Laguna de la Merced, which was the original name given in the U.S. Coast Survey maps, later translated to Lake Merced. Laguna is probably more accurate. It was a lagoon. And in this 1869 map, which is based on 1850 to 1857 topography, you can see an outlet channel. May have been somewhat, I suspect that is a little more linear than natural. It may have been a canal to allow floodwaters to get out, but it was actively in communication to the ocean until the 1895, and then it was actually dammed by a water company shortly after that. So the lagoon did have an ocean connection, and it did have a brackish fauna, an invertebrate fauna, which was still present as a relic in the 1950s, even though it had been cut off for half a century from any communication with the ocean for, again, half a century. It has a long history of modifications. Jumping ahead off slide, in the 1950s, people were dumping copper sulfate in it to control the algae, quite toxic stuff. Rotenone, the pyrethrin insecticide, was dumped into Lake Merced to kill off all the fish, so there'd be more room and less competition for the steelhead, the rainbow trout that were stocked in it. So all kinds of alterations, chemical and physical, and the flora has changed very radically. I'll just, without going into the details, I'll just give you the two endpoints, show you what is there now and what we've lost. Next slide. Also, I circled that little separate Laguna Puerca to show you that there are true lake-like lagoons in the dunes that had no connection to the ocean. They're really a different type. Well, this is 2022. That pea green color is microscopic algae. It's plankton. Lake Merced is very highly nutrient loaded. It varies between nitrogen limited and phosphate limited, but that's an April photo. That's not even summer. So the nutrient conditions are off the chart at the extreme end of nutrient enriched. And there is a continuous fringe of nitrogen loving robust marsh, mainly cattails and tules, and not much else. That's typical of reservoirs that have artificially stabilized water levels. You tend to get dominance by a few tall, emergent, competitively dominant species. And that is the norm for the lagoon today. I will not dwell on the modern flora. There is stuff there. There is a flora of Lake Merced, but I want to focus in on what was there and how far it has changed from the original condition. Next slide. These, I'm just giving a handful of representative species that are good ecological indicators of past conditions. Now, there's a lot of wetlands that were connected on the slopes and the seeps above the lagoon. These are aquatic species that have high fidelity to clear, deep, nutrient-poor waters. For example, Illinois pondweed, Potamagitan lenoensis, formerly, I think it was called lucida. It's associated with Sierran lakes on granites, cold, nutrient-poor lakes. Same with Potamagitan natans. These are not tolerant of eutrophic conditions at all. And of course, these are long gone. Water pennywort, actually, this is the whorled pennywort. This is not the common, almost invasive pennywort that you see at the margins, say Abbott's Lagoon in Point Reyes. This is a very diminutive creeper, and you often see it in dune ponds like Lawson's Landing, Dillon Beach, where you have 4 to 5 foot deep ponds that draw down seasonally in very nutrient poor or calcium rich waters, or sometimes acidic waters, but usually calcium rich. These were recorded at Lake Merced. These are, and at this time, there were no 19th century records of tules and cattails. All of the records of tules and cattails are 20th century, actually late 19th century, when the damming was occurring, when it was starting to get altered. But that was not the original vegetation. It was much more like mountain lake, nutrient poor, high diversity. Next species, sorry, next slide, more species. Here we go. This is the other end of that spectrum. Some of these examples, since they're not local from Lake Merced, these are from dune systems up here in Mendocino, like that. These are dune slacks with Carex obnupta. And Sisyrinchium californicum, which often grows on very acidic, wet sand, older sands. Sparganium eurycarpum, burr reeds. These actually grow in Pilarcitos Creek in sandy, nutrient-poor soils. They don't compete that great with cattails and tules, which are more aggressive. These are the species that we have collections of, often only at Lake Merced. So these are not part of that flexible flora. These are the ones that snapped. And there's a much longer list, and I'd be going even more over time if I went through them. But they give you an indication of the ecological affinities of that historic Merced flora. It was very nutrient poor. Next slide. And this is one on the shoreline, just harking back to, this is a Lake Merced species that occurred well, we have no other records of it but Lake Merced in San Francisco, except right now we do have, Michael Chassé told me there is one population of this left at Fort Funston. Back in the 90s, I think Pete Holleran discovered one in some of the sandy fill by the Oceanside Water Treatment Plant, probably resurrected from a seed bank. This is silvery beach pea, Lathyrus littoralis. Where you do find them on the Central Coast, they're few and far between in populations, but they're often near washovers or tidal inlets like Abbott's Lagoon, Pilarcitos Creek mouth. They had that affinity for low-lying beaches. And just to point out that these may be gone, but not forever, just as Pete Holleran's rediscovery from an old seed bank that got graded into the sand embankment by Great Highway a few decades ago. Very recently in, this is Mendocino, Big River, town of Mendocino, at the location of a large beach fire pit, a population of silvery beach pea reappeared after absence since the 1930s. So sometimes these long-lived seed banks, just like the Astragalus pycnostachys story in Southern California, they can get resurrected. So I'm not writing this species off, but I would love to see this reintroduced from the remnant populations we do have in San Francisco, still at Fort Funston. Next slide. Little pitch there, sorry, couldn't resist. Okay, this is the beginning of the main attraction. This is the comically rich history of Laguna Salada. Somewhat misnamed, as you'll see. The name Salada means salty, but who named it? Ranchers and farmers. What is salty to be useful for a rancher or farmer is not the same salinity range that we refer to for plant ecology. So a lot of those brackish marsh species, which are essentially freshwater species with some salt tolerance, they live in fresh to brackish conditions that cows don't drink and you can't irrigate with. So again, To a farmer, salada is too salty for use. Same for ranchers. So that's just a caveat, because I've shown you some lagoons that have those complex salinity gradients and fluctuations. So here is the original, this is the 1869 map based on 1850s topography of a large lagoon occupying what was called Salt Lake Valley. There's a little bit of the marsh symbol at the landward end, again, at the downstream end of that valley and all its freshwater runoff and seepage, suspiciously a fresh to brackish marsh gradient position in all the other lagoons, and a large, we now coarse-grained barrier beach that closes it off with no indication of an outlet. So this is typical of a very intermittent, infrequently breached lagoon. Next slide. Oh, sorry, the photo will, that photo was before the golf course when it was actively farmed. I'll show you some of the details that you can still see in that photo of the vegetation types present, and that they are fresh brackish species, but I'll show that subsequent slide. Next slide. Here is a GGNRA GIS analysis of the change in water surface area. There is the original 1860s lagoon outlined below, and the blue delineation shows the reduced extent of open water surface area. If you can see it in that central area over the writing, that is the 1990s, 2000s extent, much reduced, probably more than 2/3, 3/4. Next slide. And here's an aerial view from 1946, just after World War II, showing the still young 10-year-old or so golf course on the landward side. You can see there's been some filling, spreading of sand, the northwest end, much reduced. It's really hard to tell the marsh from the open water here. It's a very dark photo, but you can see a much reduced footprint of the lagoon, but not a huge amount of vertical change, as you'll see shortly. Next slide, please. So here are some early, these are cropped photos. They're pretty blurry, but these are early agricultural era, pre-golf course photos, before dune stabilization, before a lot of intensive management. You can see the extensive reflective water surface. When that lagoon was full, it was like Rodeo Lagoon. You don't see large swaths of dark marsh. You see water surface right up to the back of the barrier, very much like Rodeo Lagoon, which is dominated by open water. And in the foreground, you can see farm fields, which are now, of course, all of the Pacific lowlands developed. Next slide. Yeah, also the beach has no dark on it. There's no Monterey cypress grove. And here, if you look down where I have the writing, it says Beach Outlet Canal for agricultural drainage, you can see an artificial breach to let out impounded lagoon waters. Farmers are not creating breaches to let salt water in. I'm pretty sure this is a common feature that happens all the way up through Oregon, where ranchers and farmers will want to increase the areas they either graze or farm by draining the lagoons, which back up water and cause groundwater to rise behind them or submerge their fields. This happens to the Russian River. So ranchers and farmers often make artificial breach cuts to let backed up waters out, not to let tide waters in. And you can see that it's a very sharp, straight edge lagoon cut. But they do emulate what happens when lagoons overfill, just that farmers do it at much lower lagoon levels to keep the water levels down. Next slide. So Laguna Salada was being manipulated, but in a less intensive way. Here are some of the youthful foredunes. You can see there's no dune scrub, there's no consolidated ridge topography, there's no signature of migrating long dunes. These are dune hummocks. This is typical of barrier beaches that are migrating a little too fast to pick up mature dune topography. So there's probably fairly frequent alternation between storm overwashes and young dunes building up and going through another cycle of destruction, kind of regrading themselves and reassembling themselves. Very useful minor topographic barrier over this. This is probably the north end of the barrier beach. And you can see some familiar species there, the usual pioneers, Ambrosia chamasonis, beach burr, and probably pick up some Abernio latifolia. Not a lot of species tolerate this sedimentation regime. Next slide. We do have herbarium records of the species, and they're pretty much skewed to the youthful dunes, foredunes. Well, here's a later slide. This is still in the farming era. This is not in the golf course era. And you can see the lagoon, the water surface is drawn down, and you can see emergent marsh in the background. It's kind of patchy. So this is probably a marsh that's spreading over a more frequently drained lagoon from agriculture. And you can see the young, not very tall Monterey cypress grove. There are other photographs I have that make it very clear what it is. This is just showing the alignment. There is foredune stabilization. There's a fence line out there to trap sand. There's an effort to, even before the golf course, to reduce overwash, to increase wind sheltering, and to manage the hydrology. So long before the golf course, there were these alterations. But what did it do to the vegetation? Next slide. Yeah, here's that oblique view. You can see the young Monterey cypress grove. You can see some sand fencing. There's even a little bit of Ammophila, which is now Calamagrostis, reassigned to a related genus. But yeah, there's an attempt to build a foredune. There is an electric power station there, probably to run an electric pump in a wooden flume to draw the waters out of that lagoon. So this is before the golf course. There's increased coastal engineering efforts. Next slide. But what was it doing? Okay, we're still in farmland. Those are trucks moving along a road at the edge of the farmland. But if you blow this photo up and you look at the patterns and you look at modern examples, these are species that are recurrent in our coastal lagoons from Santa Cruz to Mendocino. It's some submerged aquatic vegetation, kind of hard to tell a pattern. I'm inclined to think that's Stuckenia. Could be Rupia maritima as well. Those are the native floating submerged aquatic vegetation typical of these coastal lagoons over the water surface. You can see the leaf signatures of cattails, alkali bulrush, and tules. So despite all these alterations, we are still stuck in that fresh, brackish flora. Not salt marsh, not salt marsh, even with the drainage. Here's jumping to the 1960s. This is where that wooden flume was. You can still see during flood flows, there is looks like a somewhat artificial canal breach, but it's still gravity draining that lagoon during flood flows. There's a beach outlet channel that is draining the lagoon, which means that the freshwater lagoon is higher than the tides. So that was before the high capacity pump era. Next slide, which has a profound change on the vegetation. So jumping to the modern era, here is a view from 2010. I use that as a reference point because you could still kind of wander around the golf course uninvited back in those days. That was my era. You can see that now those artificial foredunes are capped with roadbed, imported rocky fill material, not much higher than a foredune, 6 feet or so, maybe above the beach level. Beaches coming up with sea level rise. And you can see all those flats, washover flats behind the foredune zone, ice plant, non-native grasses, and golf turf. Next slide. So the beach and foredunes are radically altered. Here is what's left of the lagoon interior. Because the system is pumped, let's go into that in a minute, the open water now occupies the deepest part of that lagoon. And the freshwater marsh assemblage, mainly tule and cattail, Scatoplectus californicus, Typholatifolia, have prograded, spread laterally, encroaching the lagoon that is kept constantly low and stable. That's what they're good at colonizing. So they're progressively pushing out and encroaching that open water area. There's no longer a fluctuation of either water depths or salinity that would knock these tall emergents back and reset the lagoon and have them start all over again. It's constantly drained to a preset level. So that tends to favor encroachment of a few dominant species, just like a reservoir. Next slide. And here's an interesting part I'm going to spend some time on. There is the landward end, which is, if you've seen in some of the other lagoons, this is where the freshwater end of the lagoon tends to dominate and press into brackish lagoon edges. And it has the appearance, I put a spoiler in the title, has the appearance of golf turf right down to the edge of the marsh. But is that so? It is not. I'll show you what it actually is in a sec. Next slide. Well, here's why I'm showing you all 2010 photos, or mostly 2010. Before 2015, there are these sort of funky keep out signs, not very well enforced, lots of holes in the fences for kids. Just said preservation area, off limits, a lot of weeds to preserve, I guess. And after 2015, when they did the rehabilitation project, endangered species protection became the raison d'etre for all of the exclusion, and the fences were much upgraded. I believe I do have a copy of that Fish and Wildlife Service biological opinion for red-legged frogs and San Francisco garter snakes, and I don't believe it was a strict requirement of that biological opinion. This is more of an improvisation on a previously established theme, but the gist of it is you can't botanize there anymore, not without getting into trouble. So I'm stuck about 15 years ago, but I think it still applies based on what I can peer in with Google Earth. Next slide. And remember, this is a golf course lease from San Francisco Department of Parks and Recreation. So this is San Francisco, even though it's San Mateo County. I mean, San Francisco management. So here is a close-up of what's actually going on at the edge of the lagoon. It looks like that there is a marsh boundary that is respected, and they stop mowing at the marsh. But if you look at what is in that marsh turf, it is predominantly wetland species, the same ones you've been seeing at every one of these lagoons. Scenoplectus pungans, coast bulrush, Juncus lascurii, coast bulrush, Argentina agetii, also known as Potentilla and Serena, silverweed, and the non-native widespread Agrostis stolonifera. But you could be forgiven if you thought that was a golf turfgrass sward, because, again, a little play on the flexible floras, you can mow marsh and drain it into golf turf. And I'll zoom in on that. You can see that, anyway, that photo, the main photo, it's the same vegetation on both sides of that mowing line, the same dominance, the same proportion. The difference is the mowing height. There's no mowing on one side, and there is mowing on the other. Next slide. So we are in the wetland upland transition zone, which, as you may know from other systems, that's where all the diversity naturally occurs. And here you can see a lovely native, predominantly native turf of silverweed, a brackish marsh plant, salt rust, Juncus lascurii, which doesn't look much like itself when you cut it down to a stub because it's small in cross section, and Scenoplectus pungans. I have lots more slides like this with willows and cattails right to the edge of a golf cart path, and the other side is turfgrass. But you are looking at a wetland that is mown to resemble and function as a golf turf. So this is where a lot of that missing dark matter mass of the marsh is. It's there. The groundwater elevations are maintaining freshwater marsh. It's just that it is drained and mown, so you can't recognize it. Next slide. And this is still the case. I can see these positions from Google Earth, and they are unchanged. Here is one of the wetland tests, ironically, is, would a reasonable, this is a former jurisdictional test, would a reasonable duck land in it? Well, there's a reasonable waterfowl landing in the wetland side of Laguna Salada. This is after the pumps have drawn down the lagoon water surface level to expose the muddy flats and the young emergent coast bulrush. But what looks like turfgrass, again, that is continuous vegetation dominant species of wetlands all the way through the turfgrass in the foreground. Next slide. So this is the other meaning of that flexible flora. The same dominant species are persisting despite very high capacity pumping, changing hydroperiods to something that's completely unnatural. The freshwater assemblage is still dominant on the landward side of the system. The other little nuance to this is that this shallowly submerged freshwater marsh creates a warm, shallow area with structure and attachment positions for California red-legged frogs. And in late winter, this warms up a lot faster. The water gets warmer, which is better for egg development. This is where frogs like to lay their eggs. It's in this particular vegetation of coast bulrush. It's relatively shorter and has soil or sediment at the surface to pick up that solar heating in the late winter months. So you get lots of egg masses here. Unfortunately, when the pumps kick on, the water levels drop in hours and those egg masses get stranded. Long story there, not botany, but it's one of those interactions between the altered hydrology and this vegetation structure that persists at the landward edge of Laguna Salada. But this is a stable freshwater end of the system under the managed conditions, and I'm going to assure you this would be the same if you had natural hydrology with ocean connection. This is a landward end. They're all stable like this, and almost all of these coastal lagoons have red-legged frogs in them at their landward freshwater edges, even where they have open mouths to the ocean. Next slide. And give me the hook if I am going on way too long. Anyway, here's a closer look at that freshwater marsh assemblage at the landward edge of the lagoon, Typholatifolia, California bulrush, and it is pretty much identical of the same dominant suite of species that you see in agricultural Laguna Salada, Pre-Sharp Park, Rodeo Lagoon, Laguna Creek. Okay, I'll keep going. And Scott Creek Lagoon. I mean, I see these at almost all of the same dominance and the same mix of assemblages in almost all of the landward ends of these lagoons. They're not stable, but they reassemble themselves in similar proportions in the same geomorphic positions in the lagoon. Next slide. Go down one. There we go. And here is the corresponding seaward position of seaward end of the modern Laguna Salada as of 2010. In the foreground, you can see emergent saltgrass as a dominant. This is now at the back of the washover, the relict leftover washover flats before they built the berm. And you can see those, it looks like little haystacks in the foreground. If you think back to that Laguna Creek Lagoon example where you saw the mix of pickleweed and robust tule and cattail, well, here's what happens. There must have been a few consecutive years where cattails were able to thrive and grow and form large tussocks, but then by the time this photo was taken, they must have had a pretty big salinity pulse because they're all dying back. But in the background, the same species at the landward end where freshwater seepage is pushing out into the lagoon, just across that narrow water body, same species collapse from salinity on one side, saltgrass dominance, and with no barriers, no manipulation, there is tall, robust cattail on the other side. That's the natural expression of that fresh to brackish gradient following the hydraulic conductivity of those sandy to muddy sediments. So again, no one needs to build a barrier between fresh and brackish marshes. They form their own gradients. And frogs can figure that out. Next slide. And here's some other examples of that salinity dynamic going on at the westward, seaward side of Laguna Salada. Here you can see tall tules and cattails. They've perennials, they've taken years to build, but there is evidence of a recent trend towards salinization, increased salinity, even though there is no channelized connection to the, and there's really no significant overwash, but you can see there's robust pickleweed coming in, saltgrass growing in and over the bases of cattails. So you can see there is a recent prolonged salinity regime change of at least a few years, but not enough to kill off all of the freshwater salt-sensitive species. They're still persisting. So when they're at that sort of intermediate zone of tolerance. So what's going on? If there's no overwash and there's no inlet, why is this occurring? Next slide. It has to do with the pumping and sea level rise. Next slide. Sorry, there may be a lag in my set. Oh, before I do that, here's one of the, okay, these are all flexible survivors. Let me just do that aquatic, sorry. I forgot that slide. Those are two aquatic species, native species. Can we go back one, I think? Sorry. There we go. These are two species which have been missing. These were collected in the 1920s and 30s. They are very widespread in all the relatively intact coastal lagoons with that fresh brackish gradient. Sago pondweed, which is a high value species for not only waterfowl and fish, but red-legged frogs love to lay eggs in that warm floating mat, very well protected. And Rupia marittima, which is more salt tolerant, forms extensive beds in lagoons. It is apparently missing from Laguna Salada. You can pick this up visually from quite a distance, and they disperse very easily. In fact, the new ponds that were created by GG&RA at Maury Point, within 2 years of their construction, sago pondweed colonized them. So they are being dispersed by waterfowl, but they are not establishing in Laguna Salada. It may have to do with something other than salinity that affects water quality. And I'll point to that in a sec. That's a setup. Next slide. Sorry about the sequence. Okay, so again, here's that barrier preventing significant overwash. Notice that the height of that road base fill, the berm, which has been referred to as some kind of barrier, it's only the height of a normal foredune. It's 1 to 2 meters, less than 2 meters in any case. And notice that on the seaward side, many of the rapid colonizers, high capacity dispersal species like Ambrosia chamasonis, beach burr, a little less yellow sand verbena, Abronia latifolia, they're kind of pressed up against the toe of this artificially raised berm, but it's not doing anything that most foredunes don't accept, that it does not flex when there's a storm. It does not reassemble and build back up. It just acts as a wall that erodes, and of course it's impermeable, so it gullies from runoff and they come back and patch it. But impermeable structures don't really work well in this environment. Permeable sands do. Next slide. So there's our foredune flora, somewhat resilient, but also impoverished. Well, here's the real driver. This is the pump station at the south end of Laguna Salada. There's a pump house. It's about 10 years ago, it was replaced with a much higher capacity pump. There's a dredged forebay that cuts out all of the tule and cattail that encroaches this area. The tules and cattails can really slow the flow of drainage water. So in order for the pumps to work without being constrained by the drag on that flow through the marsh, they have to dig that out to create a supply of water that can keep up with that incredible pump. So there's the pump intake. The dominants here, again, the two dominant species, California bulrush, California tule and broadleaf cattail. Next slide, you'll see what 5 years of growth does when you keep the water levels almost perfectly stable, and you exclude all salts. It just completely closes up that forebay because the water levels are just too constant. So that'll get dredged out again. This is actually going to choke the flows. They can run the pumps and it creates a water surface slope. So this is a really hard to manage system if you keep draining it so intensely that you can't use natural fluctuations to loosen up the vegetation. Next slide. And that's also during a drought, so we have less water. Well, there goes Laguna Salada out to sea. That's when the pumps are running. This is, you can see the old pumps are left over on the beach. This, to me, is not so much flood control. This is wetland drainage. There's not a lot of this on the coast. I don't think anybody else I can think of, farmers, ranchers, I don't think anyone has direct pumping down of freshwater lagoons to the ocean. This is it. It's kind of unique. It's a holdover from that old era where you saw the electric power lines pumping out the lagoon. That failed. They use gravity flow, but we are continuing to invest in it. You can see that large riprap wall. That is to protect the pump house. So we're really digging in here to keep pumping that lagoon down almost to the bottom, so it's not much more of a water hazard. So you saw the effect of that on the vegetation and a little bit on red-legged frogs interacting with that vegetation with water levels. What else could that be doing with interactions with sea level rise and salinity? Next slide. I'll pose that question to set this up. So this is a view, something I'd seen before. I'd noticed some salt burns on some of the turf grass earlier, didn't think much of it. Happened to get out there in January 2015, the middle of a mega drought. So there's not a lot of rain. There has been rain, but this is not the day after a heavy rain. And there are what look like pools in, it kind of looks like it's flat and there's pools, but it's not. That's a slope. That is the back slope looking directly behind the outer roadbed lagoon. And that is flowing water. That is actually water surface that's rippled and has currents going through it. It was about 4 parts per thousand brackish salinity. And it was following, this is January, so these are spring high tides. We had some very high surf, not overtopping the berm. What high surf does during super elevated spring tides is it pumps up beach groundwater. Remember the permeable Rodeo Lagoon? The barrier beach acts as kind of a buffer for groundwater that can get pumped up by waves from the ocean or by an overfilled lagoon with hydraulic head pushing fresh water out. Works both ways. So after many, many days of this is drought, so the lagoon is low lagoon and very high waves and high spring tides, the groundwater in the beach is being super recharged. There's a very steep gradient. That's groundwater, beach groundwater, which is brackish, emerging from the slope and rushing down to the lagoon. Next slide. So the fact that there is no accumulated fresh water there to push back, you are effectively inducing salinity intrusion. So what does that look like? Well, there's the ice plant, which is slightly tolerant of brackish conditions, or at least slow to die. And there's turf grass showing some, that's not what turf grass does with water logging over a matter of a few days. That's brownout, and it's very rusty. I won't go into the chemistry, but that's from waterlogged sulfidic soil contacting oxygen. That's releasing sulfuric acid and forming iron oxide. It's typical of brackish wetlands that have a lot of drawdown. So there's some interesting chemistry going on there that's beyond salinity. Maybe part of the reason we don't have any rupia. Next slide. What does that look like in the summer? Okay, drought era. Notice that the golf greens farther from the barrier beach in the background remain green. The ones that are all sloping towards Laguna Salada are browned out. That little bit of salt seepage salinized the soil. There are limits on how much you could irrigate that out during a drought. It killed acres and acres of turf grass. Next slide. That's November 2016, a year later. So that's wet season. And there's I can give you a whole series of views. There's just the next panorama segment of that view. I mean, there was mass dieback of the golf greens. This is a natural coastal process, barrier beaches being pumped up with waves to elevate the groundwater, but now interacting instead of a lagoon with a counter pressure, hydraulic head pushing back, pumping down the lagoon basically sucks the ocean in through this sand barrier. It reverses the salinity gradient. So it's pulling salts into the basin. Next slide. And you can see this very clearly close up. You can actually see salts efflorescing, forming little tiny wispy crystals from evaporation of capillary movement of that saturated soil, when evaporation exceeds the rate at which capillary movement of water from the soil can resupply it, it just forms little crystals on all the fibers of the dead grass. So it gets this whitish cast on top of the brown. And you can see it's getting invaded now by halophytes, not a native halophyte, that's Spergularia rubra, sand spurry, salt spurry. So the weeds now are picking up this salt efflorescence signal, again, induced by the pumping. Remember Pilocitus Creek right behind the beach? They're not salty environments inherently. This is not from salt spray. You can see the Gulf greens in the back are perfectly, down by the lagoon level where they're not getting infiltration of groundwater from the beach. They're perfectly healthy. Next slide. So the irrigation's not stopped. Otherwise, we wouldn't see green golf turf in the background. Next slide. Okay, well, that's where we left Laguna Salada. That is still going on. I'll just go to our last lagoon in Pacifica. This, of course, is so long forgotten. We think of San Pedro Creek as the freshwater feature on the coast. There was no San Pedro defined creek. There's no channel that reaches the ocean here. The whole valley had diffuse, unchannelized flows through what looks like, that's the symbol for woodland. So that has to be alder, willow, wetland woodland, because it's a marsh symbol all around it, the horizontal hatching. Marsh symbol and a very oddly shaped lagoon, and a small outlet through the barrier beach. So this is a familiar configuration, particularly if you go further north, north of Mendocino. This is a freshwater feature. We have no botanical records from this area that I can find, but based on the topography and the hatching and the symbol for woodland, I'm pretty sure this is all freshwater marsh peat, and that makes perfect sense because this was first converted to farmland. So again, this is the last trace of what was one of the larger lagoons right next to Laguna Salada, and it just shows you that these freshwater lagoons, not salt marshes, were a clean sweep right down the coast, all the way down to our last one. Next slide. And that is San Pedro Creek mouth, which is not really a remnant of that system. It's sort of a self-reassembled reconstruction. There was some restoration work here. That's Highway 1, the bridge. The channelized flow from that very diffuse alluvial lowland is now concentrated into a creek. Steelhead must have gone across that outlet and swum through those riparian woodlands when they were flooded, but now it's channelized flow. And again, the same suite of species we see at the freshwater end of the gradient at Pillar Point, coast bulrush, California tule, broadleaf cattail, and also that Vancouver wild rye in the background, that lighter colored green. So again, freshwater marsh, right? This is our effectively our heir to Lake Matilda. Next slide. And we're getting down to the end. I'm sure you want to close off. A look to the future. Okay, some things are clearly not going to continue to work with the way we have managed our coastal lagoons through the 20th century. Laguna Salada is no longer host to, Lake Merced is no longer host to the annual stocking of rainbow trout. They don't last long enough. They just basically die in that polluted water. That's been stopped. It's not going to be a very great emergency water supply if it is full of harmful algal blooms. Laguna Salada, you can see where that's going to go as sea level rises and the pumps keep drawing stuff down. That's only going to go in one direction. Catastrophic flooding, instead of a flexible barrier that allows the overfilled lagoon to cut through and drain itself rapidly, like the Wallala and Rodeo Lagoon example, that is a dam that's going to hold water on the wrong side of the dam. It's an impoundment. And if the pumps are under 8 feet of water, that's not a great way to deal with future sea level rise and flooding. So some things, like it or not, are going to change. And I think those can be viewed as potential opportunities, like the very modest Pillar Point Harbor example, where we can work ahead of erosion events and say, okay, we can change our plan. Here's a wonderful example of long developed area in the Presidio. This is behind the 1990s Crissy Field Lagoon. This is the new quartermaster reach that the Park Service and Presidio Trust have extended below Doyle Drive. Very rapid return on investment. We're creating space to accommodate sea level rise and also create more open space for recreation, which is very much in demand. Whereas, say, for example, I'll be a little partisan, golf courses are declining in demand and are closing all over the Bay Area. So opportunities, whether driven by climate events, extreme events, or by changing economics, I am looking forward to an era where we get to rethink our coastal infrastructure and the fate of our very flexible coastal lagoon flora elements, as well as the potential return of the less flexible ones to improved reconstructed coastal lagoons. And that is my excessively long talk. I apologize for that. And I'll conclude that there.
Thank you so much.
Well, can we see you again? I hope so.
Oh,
wow.
The lights went out. Sorry.
Oh my. Oh, that looks really spooky.
There.
Okay.
Now I'm getting you glare. Sorry, it got dark during my talk.
That's all right. That's all right. Wow. That just sort of it's pretty mind blowing.
That's the light bulb idea over my head, by the way.
Right. Well, of course, many of these things environmentalists have been preaching for, in parts for decades, especially, the whole battle with Laguna Salada, so also, we just really need to get some of our city agency leaders to see this presentation.
Right.
Well, I guess it got so caught up with just frogs and snakes, no one ever got to the plants and the vegetation and the ecosystem. So I really appreciate this opportunity to bring the rest of the ecosystem and the plants and the story. The plants really narrate the story very well. I think you understand the system better if the plants are in the picture. So CNPS, thank you.
Yeah, well, we're renewed in our inspiration to take this topic up again, because it was a bit of a bruising battle for many.
Yeah.
10, 15 years ago. So
well, it's a generation later, all new people.
Yeah.
Well,
That's
some
right.
no, some of the same people, but
yeah, but new realities, and
yes,
many of the things that people were saying then actually have come to pass, and so time to we're at a period of time where we're sort of realizing a lot of past cultural mistakes and trying to address those, and these were sort of that, so anyways,
We may have lost.
I think we lost your video there again, but I do see that
I stopped it and just
okay.
Just in case I needed to respond to something, I wanted to make sure I didn't cut out.
Yeah,
I think we do have a couple of questions if you have a moment.
Yeah, no, it's not.
If you do, I do. Sorry, as usual, I put too many slides in.
Well, I'll tell you what, people have stayed on the line here, and yeah,
great. Thank you.
It was longer than our usual presentations, but people are fascinated with it, and most everyone has stayed. So,
wow.
And there's only a couple questions here. One, Susan Mulaney asked, "What project are you working on now? Anything on the peninsula?"
I'm still working at Pillar Point Harbor, that little dune restoration there, sort of monitoring now, but also trying to get some of the species back in. There's Lathyrus littoralis should go back in there. We haven't gotten that one in. I'm also working partly on the San Francisco Estuary Institute's Sunset Resilience Project, which includes North Ocean Beach. And also I have a small dune restoration component of the rapidly changing, hope get their name. It's basically South of Sloat project from SFPUC. I think it's called the Ocean Beach Climate Change Adaptation Project. That's basically the the revision of Great Highway and the setback and dune restoration and the setback armoring. I'm on for a sub consultant role in that. That's a moving target, very rapidly moving
Very
target.
exciting. I mean,
Yeah.
climate change there is really
right, and very
eminent.
topical because right now there's a ballot measure to turn the Great Highway into a park, as it were. They're calling it a park. And of course, we're seeing, you know, some good things that could come out of it, but also there's a lot of concerns. And so we've been reviewing the Ocean Beach Master Plan over the last couple of days and trying.
That's good to hear. And I think it's important for CNPS to be a voice at the table. Otherwise, all the squeaky wheels are just, you know, just the dog advocate or just the people who want to litigate. So having your views brought forward. Oh, there's Bob Battaglio saying make the Great Highway dune again. Yeah, it's important for CNPS to be a voice at that table. So yeah, I'm glad you're all interested in this. So
yeah,
contact those folks.
Yeah, the more you look, the more complex of a situation it is, of course. But you know, let's see, there's Sam Casillas or mentioned the city of Pacifica believes that they are able to build a seawall all the way from the pier to Maury Point and will stop flooding. Flooding which way, I guess, is what is flooding coming from the ocean or flooding?
Yeah.
I'm not sure about that. So
they can meet in the middle. That's a Bob Battaglio answer. Bob's saying not a good idea. Bob has worked on this a lot. So that's not, I'm not going to play a coastal engineer hydrologist, but yeah, he's a longtime Pacifica resident and a super knowledgeable coastal engineer who knows the area intensely. But yeah, they're just like the 1982 event that flooded that area from Overwash. I mean, look, it's just inevitable. We're going to have major events again, and you want to set this up so that it has a quick release mechanism, and that you're protecting flood where they are and not using one land use as an excuse to build really inefficient and potentially hazardous forms of flood control that we've inherited. You need to, I guess the gist is, without getting into details, you need to rethink a lot of things. Everyone wants to keep things the same, the way they've had them, everyone's pleased, but the world is changing around us and the land uses, the constituencies are changing. And again, working all over the Bay Area and wetlands, I just am astonished to see how, since Laguna Salada came up, how many golf courses have closed. So it's probably going to come up at some point without anyone, you know, taking aim at it. It's just going to come up. So I hope to be around to be part of that discussion about what the options are.
Right on. A couple of other things, if you don't mind. Should San Francisco's Laguna Honda be called Lago Honda?
I don't know. The interior, see, just in terms of both geomorphology and also the vegetation, all of the lagunas that are lakes, that are inland lakes, that are dune dammed ponds, like Mountain Lake, for example, is the archetype. Those are formed on terrestrial landscapes by dunes migrating and impounding the heads of drainages. So those are kind of real ponds or lakes, depending on their geometry. Lagoons, in the sense of a coastal lagoon, are impoundments by beaches close to sea level at the shoreline. So they share a name. I mean, they both mean lake, just, you know, but true lakes are inland things, and the coastal lagoons have that unique property of being, you know, shoreline related features. And we're getting better taxonomies now. They tend to be biased for, you know, fish or just, you know, specific guilds, but physically they're really different beasts, and their sea level rise dynamic. Remember, lagoons migrate with the shore, lakes don't. They get built once and that's pretty much it.
Right. And one last question, and then we'll call it a night.
Okay.
Jim and Pat Kramer, ask, any chance that a water SF golf course pumps out to sea, I'm presuming they're talking about Laguna Salada again, is fresh enough to have been useful to them? They use a lot of fresh water.
Yeah, and I think there's been investigations of Calera Creek water being pumped over. But, you know, making better use of a bad plumbing system is probably not at the top of my list for rethinking. I don't see a future in the plumbing as it exists. I mean, it's like a lot of things on the coast. People say, enjoy it while you have it, but when it goes, don't replace it in kind or don't plan on it. It's like, it's kind of wasteful. It's kind of harmful to the system. It's probably not sustainable. If you want to let it play out, I mean, if it's still working and people are still happy, you know, wait till it breaks. When it breaks, then let's think about replumbing. It's kind of like, you know, floodplains and other kinds of, like, you're not going to yank people out of their homes until there's a flood. And then when they ask you for, you know, bailouts to rebuild it, then you have the grown-up talk. That's what I'm that's what I'm kind of waiting for. The grown-up talk.
We have a lot of grown-up talks ahead of us, unfortunately.
Yeah.
More than usual, perhaps.
So anyway, someone said I'm not on social media, but feel free to distribute my Gmail address. I'm happy to take further questions. I know I went on, as usual, way too long. So if people have follow-up questions, I welcome email contact.
It was a joy to learn all this history. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Really good to be with
appreciate
you,
it.
and hope to see you in person soon.
Okay.
And good night, everybody, and we'll see you
Good
next month.